some of the SAT reading and writing material. So we're going to start with a graph-based question today, which can look really intimidating because it looks like they're combining the math and the English sections and giving you twice as much to look at, but in reality, they're actually just giving you twice as much information to double check your answer. So it's like you can use two sources if one of them is a little bit harder to understand or one of them gives you a little bit less information. They're just giving you more resources. So don't be intimidated when you see what looks like math and a lot of reading in one question. So to start, let's take a look at just the graph on its own. So we'll start with the title here. Approximate rates of speech and information conveyed for 5 languages. So it might sound silly to stop here or to pause, but it is really important to understand what this graph is going to be conveying, because a lot of times they can use very scientific leaning questions, or they can use questions where some of the data is, the titles of the data are written in Latin, or something that initially looks very intimidating or confusing. So it's just a good idea to make sure you know exactly what this graph is conveying. So we're looking at the rate of speech versus how much information is conveyed, right? So how quickly you're speaking and how much information you're actually getting in those words. So let's look at each of the columns here. So starting with language. So pretty clear, we've got all these different languages. The rate of speech that they are measuring in syllables per second. So we can see, even just from looking at this, Spanish is spoken the most quickly. Vietnamese is spoken Thai is spoken the slowest, and there are several languages that fall somewhere in the middle. Moving over to the third column, rate of information conveyed in bits per second. So now if we look at the second and third columns together, you can see how quickly people are speaking versus how much information is in those words. So if we compare something like, let's take the first two here. So we have Serbian and Spanish. So Serbian is spoken slower than Spanish, and it conveys less information than Spanish does, which makes sense. You would think that the faster you're speaking, the more information you can get out. Whether or not that's true, let's keep reading throughout the graph. So we'll compare Spanish and Vietnamese. Again, Spanish is spoken at a rate of 7.7 syllables per second, and you get 42 pieces of information. Whereas Vietnamese is spoken much slower, so you're only getting 5.3 syllables per second, but the rate of information conveyed is actually higher than that of Spanish. So here we have a bit of a discrepancy between the speed at which something is spoken and the amount of information. So even just looking at this graph on its own without consulting the paragraph at all, we can already see that there isn't that automatic relationship between speed of speech and information conveyed. So that's a really good thing to keep in mind. When you are looking at these kinds of graphs, it's also a good idea if you look at them and you notice something that looks a little strange or that you might want to flag, go ahead and do it. You can write in the margins of your test, you can have scratch paper if you want, absolutely fine. So if we were to look at this and say, interesting, looking at just these 3 rows here, there's something funky going on. Let's read a little bit farther into the paragraph. A group of researchers working in Europe, Asia, and Oceania conducted a study to determine how quickly different Eurasian languages are typically spoken in syllables per second, and how much information they can effectively convey in bits per second. They found that although languages vary widely in the speed at which they are spoken, the amount of information languages can effectively convey tends to vary much less. Thus, they claim that 2 languages with very different spoken rates can nonetheless convey the same amount of information in a given amount of time. Alright, let's go back and look for a couple things here. So generally these questions will give you a bit of context at the beginning. It's important to know this, but this is not necessarily where the bulk of your information is going to come from. So let's start here. They found that although languages vary widely in the speed at which they are spoken, the amount of information languages can effectively convey tends to vary much less. So this can sound like a really complicated, really academic, heightened language kind of phrase, it's important to know that you can break it down into your own words. If you can simplify something, if you can summarize it and simplify it, that's a really good indicator that you know exactly what it's saying. So let's try and do that. So they found that although languages vary widely in the speed at which they are spoken, so here's an important part here. We've got different speeds of language. The amount of information languages can effectively convey tends to vary much less. So this is kind of the bulk of our data here. Widely different speeds, relatively similar amount of information. So again, if we look up here, we can see, yeah, these numbers tend to range a little bit more, right? We've got 4.7 to 7.7. That's, almost 2/3 of the speed. Thai is almost 2/3 of the speed of Spanish. But then these numbers are a little bit more similar, right? We're ranging from low 30s to low 40s. So it's good to know that our paragraph and our data align, and it's pretty easy to see where they're getting that information from. So then let's keep going here. Thus, they claim that two languages with very different spoken rates can nonetheless convey the same amount of information in a given amount of time. Anytime you see the phrase, thus they claim, this is an important thing to flag. This is essentially the researcher's thesis, or the main point, or the main argument that they're trying to make. So again, reading through this, two languages with very different spoken rates can nonetheless convey the same amount of information in a given amount of time. If you can summarize this and simplify it in a way that makes sense to you, great. Another way you can phrase it is that speed does not determine the amount of information given, or something like that, right? As long as you're not changing what the actual information is, you can rephrase it in a way that makes more sense to you. And again, feel free to take your scratch paper, write your notes in the margins, whatever it takes for you to understand what the passage is saying. All right, so let's take a look now at the actual question. Which choice best describes data from the table that support the researcher's claim? All right, so again, we're looking to support the researcher's claim. This is a very common question, right? They're just saying, researchers claim this, what's the data that backs it up? It's not very common for them to say what is something that would contradict the information, but you always want to double check, because they can ask that. Just make sure that you know exactly what you're looking for within the question. So which data in the table best describes this idea that the speed of the language does not determine the amount of information? So let's go through these answers here. When you're looking at questions that also involve a graph or some kind of data or some kind of statistic, it's a good idea to look through and see which answers you can disprove. And this can be for a number of reasons. This can be because they have misinterpreted the data, or they're actually saying something that's factually incorrect, or they're using data that is true but it's not relevant. It has nothing to do with what the actual question is asking. So for these kinds of questions, let's try a process of elimination approach. So let's look at the first one here. Among the 5 languages in the table, Thai and Hungarian have the lowest rates of speech and the lowest rates of information conveyed. So what we're trying to do is either prove or disprove this and this here. Let's compare Thai and Hungarian. So let's start with lowest rates of speech. So Thai, we can see 4.7, Hungarian, we can see 5.9. Already, we can disprove this because Vietnamese has a lower rate of speech than Hungarian. So we don't even have to look at any of the rest of the question. We can say because any part of it is incorrect, the whole thing, we can rule out the whole thing. All right, let's look at the second one. Vietnamese conveys information at approximately the same rate as Spanish, despite being spoken at a lower rate. Or at a slower rate. Let's take a look. Again, this is 2 pieces of information that we're trying to either prove or disprove. So Vietnamese conveys information at approximately the same rate as Spanish. So let's take a look here. So we have Vietnamese, let's put this in the other column. we have Vietnamese and Spanish. So I would say yes, they're within 0.5 bits of each other. So yes, we can say this part of the answer is correct, despite being spoken at a slower rate. So Vietnamese is spoken at a slower rate than Spanish. Let's take a look. So yes, absolutely. So we can see here, this part of the data is correct, this part of the data is correct. This is a pretty good indicator that this is our correct answer. So we can put that in as a placeholder, unless you're super, super, super confident, which in this case you could be, because there is nothing wrong with this answer. But let's just take a look at the other answer options to double check. Among the 5 languages in the table, the language that is spoken the fastest is also the language that conveys information the fastest. So, although this one might be factually correct, let's take another approach to try and either prove or disprove it. So, let's go back to this here. What data supports the researchers' claim? Well, their claim is that different speech rates can convey the same amount of information. So actually, even if this ended up being correct, it would be counter to what the researchers are trying to prove, right? This is implying that the rate of speech is equal to the amount of information conveyed, which is completely the opposite of what they're trying to say. So this one we can rule out because it's not relevant. It actually doesn't support the claim. So then let's look at D. Serbian and Spanish are spoken at approximately the same rate, but Serbian conveys information faster than Spanish does. Let's see. So Serbian and Spanish are spoken at approximately the same rate. Let's go back and see. So they're within about 0.5 bits of each other again. So yes, we could say that that is approximately the same rate. And then if we go back down to the question, it says, but Serbian conveys information faster than Spanish does. Let's see. It definitely does not. So by virtue of this part being incorrect, we can rule out this answer. So it's always a good idea, especially if you have some extra time, if you're feeling pretty confident in your one answer, if you can double check it in a way, disprove some of the other answers, that's great. When you're given questions like these, it's a really good idea to have multiple different approaches that you can use. So proving and disproving information, fact-checking something, using process of elimination, those are all really, really effective strategies. So if you're looking for more questions like these, there are a number of different full-length practice tests online. They include reading and writing modules, math modules. You can download the PDF, go through them. There are the answer keys are available as well. I personally use the ones from the College Board because they are certified and reputable and great practice. And then if you're looking to drill the same kind of question over and over and over again, I would recommend using the Khan Academy. Everything is online there. You can sort by question type, and you can just drill the same thing over and over again. All right, that's it for this lesson. Happy studying, and I hope to see you in the future.